Okay, welcome back to Unsolved No More. Redemption from Death Row. Today we'll be talking again to Bill Nogueira. Bill, let me go over a little bit about Bill and my association with him, because I have a feeling this video is probably going to attract some viewers that haven't watched my other shows with Bill. So Bill Nogueira is a convicted murderer from California. I believe in the early 80s, when he was, 18 years old, he murdered his girlfriend's mother. He's been on death row at San Quentin for 40 years. And he just recently, within the last couple months, got off death row and was moved to Corcoran State Prison, basically with life in prison now through his appeals. Bill makes no mistakes that he's guilty, that he did murder his girlfriend's mother. But Bill, while at St. Quentin, was housed with and took care of the medical unit of serial killers, including the scorecard killer, William Bonin, Bill Suft, Richard Ramirez, Rodney Acola, Joe Naso, just a lot of them. He got to know them. He knows how people operate, and serial killers. And, I'm not saying that this case has anything to do with a serial murder or anything like that, but I like to get insights of people who have committed the act of murder. And that's what I like to do. I take academia, I take profilers, but I also take people that have committed the act of murder and who have associated their whole life around these type of evil people. I make no bones about it, and I've used confidential informants my whole career, undercover when I worked for the FBI, when I worked undercover in the county drug unit. So it's nothing new to me to get information from people who are quote-unquote bad people. Not all of them are bad. But, so that's the background on Bill Nogueira. So I wanted to talk to him about these Keddie murders because it's a fascinating case study. Is it a who's done it? Yes, nobody has been arrested. But I think if you step back and you look at the case through an unbiased lens, that things start to become clear. And you don't have to go down all these rabbit holes, and you can make things more complicated than what they are. And people do that a lot. Now, I looked at this case, it's probably been a year ago now. And I think that maybe I was guilty of zoning in on things, but I zoned in on things for different reasons, like the crossing of Dana's legs, meaning to me he was turned over. Those is just for viewers to see what I am seeing, okay? Has nothing to do with the overall picture of what's going on here. But it's just little details that people like to know, and it drives them crazy. Like, why is the phone off the hook? Or, why is there a front sight of an air rifle here? All those things. Some of it may be important, some not so. But I wanted to talk to Bill and get his opinion on things. So Bill gets a copy of this case file, essentially, what he can get publicly and read and go from there. And I like that, because sometimes when you get this big stack, like sometimes when law enforcement asks me to help on their cases, I've gotten boxes. And sometimes you don't need that, because that is when you start going down the rabbit holes, because things don't make sense. I was just looking at a case yesterday or this morning from 1976 where a group of guys stopped at a random house in the area, like in the Royal area, much like Keddie, and killed everybody in the house, kids included. And how you could go down so many different rabbit holes. But there was a confession, and therefore you could piece together what happened. Things don't have to be so complicated all the time. I just like to get like the first 20, 25 pages of a police report. That's it. All that other stuff, yes, there could be something very significant in that. But most of it, 90% of it, is noise. It's just noise. It takes you away from the focus. Oh, there was a party next 2 doors up, and the person there is involved, and it has nothing to do with nothing, Or there's just so many different variables that takes you away from what you should be focusing on. And that's the crime scene in general, So in this case, I wanted Bill, who didn't know anything about the case. Remember, he's been in prison, so he's not spoiled, meaning he's not biased by the movies with The Strangers, Cabin 28, all these different things, the websites, the web sleuths. He doesn't have any of that. He'll get a packet in the mail, where he'll research the case and give his opinion on it. And I value that opinion. Sometimes we agree, sometimes we don't agree. We'll see what happens on this case, but it's important to look at things through a non-biased lens, a non-skewed lens. These people, and I'm telling you, I just got dealt with it in the Stephen Avery case, that spend their entire being on cases. Although some of them have the best intention, they are some of the worst people to take information from. Because when you get so invested into a case and you start going down rabbit holes and making assumptions, it's a dangerous area, because you become infatuated with the case and you start trying to zone in on every little detail when it doesn't matter. It's almost like standing up to a painting and focusing in on a little section of the painting, and you're trying to make sense of it, and you're like, well, what is that? Why would he do that? And your brain is all noisy, trying to figure it out. If you would just take 5 steps back, then the whole picture becomes clear. That should be your approach to unsolved cases. So I try not to get too wrapped up, too invested, because I think more accurate assessments have been done by people who are brought in, know nothing about the case, and they just look at it, and they don't have to deal with all the noise, all the rumors. I'm guilty of that too. I was guilty of that in the Gail Matthews homicide, of which I will be doing a case shortly on that. As a matter of fact, I will be talking about that case with Fox News podcast tomorrow. So I was guilty of that. That's my point of bringing that up. It wasn't to plug that, although it was a good opportunity for me to do so. I listened to noise and I went down all those routes when I shouldn't have. Just step back and look at it. It becomes a lot clearer. So I'm hoping that that's what Bill's going to do in this case, and we'll see what he comes up with, and we'll go from there. When I first did my assessment of this case, I believe, it's been a while now, but I believe my focus was on Sue and Tina, and I leaned towards Tina because of her being taken from the home and then being her body found 3 years later, her remains. And I was trying to wrap my brain around why. Why take her if she wasn't the target, the motive of this? But I believe I also said in that, why it doesn't make any sense to kill an entire family to snag her, because you could take Tina at any time. She went to school. She got off a school bus. You take her then when there's no witnesses and you don't have to shed blood when you don't need to. I mean, so I remember thinking about that when doing that Keddie case, and I think basically I came to the assumption or the the theory that Sue was most likely the motive, the object, the reasoning why this murder took place. And I know I had a hard time, if I remember back correctly, between trying to decide whether it was Tina or Sue. But I think that I came to the resolution that it was Sue that was the target here, and everybody else was kind of like collateral damage, and that the boys, Dana and Johnny, walked in on something happening, I believe, because of the way they were dressed compared to Sue's dress. So we'll see what Bill has to say, and we'll go from there. So watch, hopefully learn, and enjoy, this assessment. All right, we're back with Bill Noguera. We're here to talk today about the Keddie murders. This is a pretty infamous case. A lot of movies have been made of this, some fiction, some nonfiction. In fact, I've been in contact a lot with Sheila Sharp, who was the teenage daughter of Sue and brother to Johnny and Tina, who ultimately died in this tragedy. Sheila Sharp and I have been getting together, at least sending some emails, talking, and been meaning to go out there and meet her in California. Just haven't done it yet. But right now, we're going to try to get this back in the spotlight, get the opinion of Bill, and see if his is different from mine, and we'll go from there. You ready for this, Bill?
Yeah, I am, and I hope you can hear me okay. This is a very interesting case, and not for the obvious reasons. You and I usually see these cases, and we usually pin down someone that's not related to the case, or someone that could be a serial predator. In this case, I believe the case is a lot simpler. I believe that this case in itself was just a cover-up. And I'm going to jump up from the very beginning and say exactly that. This is a cover-up, and I have a pretty good idea of what really happened. Every piece of evidence that law enforcement could have used to apprehend the culprits were ignored, hidden, or just filed away purposely. And I'm going to go into that in a few moments, as well as why it was covered up. So with no further ado, I'd like to open with what happened that night, if it's okay with you.
Yes, let's hear this.
Okay, so obviously on April the 12th, the morning, you have a quadruple homicide. And we don't know it's a quadruple homicide till sometime later. At the crime scene on April 12th, we find, 1981, of course, at the Keddie, California, or Keddie, California, I don't know how to pronounce it, at cabin 28 of the Keddie Resorts, we find 3 victims. Sue Sharp, son John Sharp, and his friend Dana Hall Wingate. They are found by her, Sue's 14-year-old daughter, Sheila, who you had a relationship or a friendship with, or professional relationship with, who returned home after spending the night at a friend's house at 7 a.m. She discovered the gruesome scene of her mother, John, her brother, and his friend Dana. They were all in the living room, bound with medical tape as well as electrical cords binding their feet. Tina Sharp, Sue's younger daughter, was missing from the scene. In room right next door to the gruesome crime scene, there were 3 children, 2 of which were Sue's youngest children, Rick, 10 years of age, Greg, 5 years of age, and their friend Justin Smart. They again were unharmed and found in a room just next to the crime scene. I want people to keep in mind that Justin Smart is of particular interest to me in this case. He is a friend that was staying over that night. So, to the crime scene. Sue, the mother, who I believe was killed first because of the way of the attack. It looked very impulsive. A knife through the throat. She wasn't slashed. There was a stab wound through the throat that cut her larynx and nicked her spine. That's a very deep cut. It's a lot of muscle, a lot of tendons in that area. That was the first victim of this. And I say that because I believe that the crime team suggests that it was very impulsive. There's a lot of anger behind it. And we've seen this with serial killers who, it wasn't anger. It was about just what they were doing. This case is a bit different, and I will lead into that as well. Also found on the living room floor next to the sofa. By the way, I'm sorry. Let me just say that she was also found nude from the waist down. She was gagged.
This call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
And her underwear were also stuffed into her mouth, and they were taped there. She was also stabbed in the chest. This crime scene at first looks like a crime of passion, but as other details come, it looks different, and I'll explain why. She also had an imprint of a Daisy 880 BB and pellet rifle to her face. And I hadn't seen the crime scene photos or the autopsy report, but I would like to know if whether the butt of that rifle to the face was the first hit to her, or if they can tell, was it made after the initial attack that killed her. Now, her son, John's throat was also slashed, but he died of blunt force trauma to the head by what seems to be a hammer. His friend Dana, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, he also had head injuries from the hammer, which I believe were done to immobilize both the young men. One was, of course, 17, and I believe the other one was 15, the younger boy, which is John. And then Dana was later strangled to death, manually strangled. It takes a lot of strength. Missing, of course, from the crime scene was Tina, the 12-year-old daughter of Sue and younger sister of John. In the crime scene, her jacket was missing, along with her shoes, which to me suggests she was taken with an intent, meaning that she just wasn't grabbed because she was a witness. They went, they looked for her jacket, they got her shoes, and then they took her. That is significant to me. There was no forced entry. The house phone was off the hook, and the cord was cut from the outlet, and the drapes were drawn. Which, the drapes doesn't say a whole lot to me. A lot of people close their drapes before they go to bed. Are you with me so far, Ken, and am I on target so far?
Yeah, so far so good. Yeah, I can hear you, and everything you're saying is jiving with what I have written down here as well.
Okay, so this crime scene, and please correct me if I'm wrong, suggests there are a lot of mistakes made from the very beginning. You and I have gone over this before with other cases, but this case specifically seems to just ignore the most obvious people involved in this case. Of course, the night of the incident and probably the first day after, it wasn't as obvious. But as the investigation begins, in my opinion, it is obvious who the culprit is, why he did it, and who was his partner in crime here.
Okay, so first off, Bill, before we get into that, does the crime scene tell you that there was more than one offender?
It suggested. Now, I've seen other cases, and look, let's be honest about this. We know the case very similar to this, and I'm sure the audience is familiar with it, which is the Chino murders. There was a mother and a father in a home. There were also, I believe, 3 children. One of them was left alive, although they sliced his throat and he was left for dead. The culprit of that case, who was arrested and convicted, was a Kevin Cooper. And this crime scene suggests that he went into the adult's bedroom first and was able to subdue a fully grown man, very strong, very aggressive father who rode horses, was in his prime health, without any problem. Took out the mother and the kids. So the crime scene does suggest that it could have been one person. I think it's 2, and that comes to light later on. He could have very easily hit the 2 boys with a hammer, which the crime scene does suggest that both boys were hit with hammers in the head. That could be just to subdue them. 2 quick hits puts them out of commission. The woman is handled later. And because they were tied, that also suggests that they were first hit, tied, and then because the woman's underwear and she was nude from the waist down, that she may have been in some way, shape, or form sexually assaulted or molested. As you know, it doesn't take sexual intercourse for it to be a sexual crime. But we don't know that for a fact. I don't know if DNA and semen samples were taken, or was there a rape kit performed on the victim. Nothing I've read suggests that. But because of later evidence, I believe 2 people were involved.
Okay.
So, again, these are events that took place that night, and it's very difficult to tell whether, with an autopsy, if the hammer blows happened prior to the stabbing. It's very difficult because as long as the person's alive, blood's still pumping, and that's how we can tell something was done first or second. And it's usually a couple moments apart. It's literally impossible to tell what happened unless the person died from the injuries and everything else was performed post-mortem. So the investigation turns into a kidnapping, or at least an alleged kidnapping of the younger daughter, Tina. But right away, instead of the police department calling in homicide, they sent over 2 FBI investigators from organized crime. That immediately sent out a signal for me. And what I read later and investigated later seems to suggest that
This call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
that organized crime plays a role in this. Not a significant role in the killing, but a role in the investigation. Are we on the same page here?
Yeah.
Okay, so in my opinion, because of what the investigation gave us, Justin Smart, who was in the bedroom the whole time, the bedroom right next to where this happened, is a key to this. And I mentioned it earlier because I felt that his presence changed the entire crime scene, or at least it suggested.
You have 60 seconds remaining.
Let me call you back. I'm on my way downstairs to go to the yard so I can be a little bit more quiet. I can concentrate. I'll be right back.
Okay.
Global Tel Link.
Hey, Ken.
Okay. Go ahead and continue if you wish.
Yeah, so this case struck me as very odd because, this isn't some small, other states where homicides are not abundant. Sacramento's right down the streets. They bring 2 organized crime FBI investigators to the homicide. The sheriff himself seems to be stumbling through this crime scene. And we know later on, because we're obviously looking at this several years later. But although this is before DNA evidence, it seems that people were trampling through this crime scene. Really no evidence was taken, and a lot of evidence was ignored. First and foremost, the father, or the stepfather of Justin Smart, plays a huge role because right away, after the investigation starts, he begins to give clues as to why he's not the perpetrator. He says that he has a hammer that's missing from his home, and then he steers the investigation away from himself. The wife of, by the way, this is how, in my opinion, this is it's almost like a triangle type of almost love affair gone wrong. And let me explain. Martin Smart is married to a woman by the name of Marilyn, and she is Sue, the victim, one of the victims, one of her best friends. And they are talking before this homicide, and Sue, who's the victim, tells Marilyn that she should leave her husband because he's being abusive towards her. What's very interesting to me is the day of the homicide, Marilyn leaves.
This call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
Marilyn leaves Martin, and there's a suggestion that's come out later on that Sue, the victim, may have been having an affair with Martin, which explains a lot here. Witnesses state that Martin was extremely upset that Sue, the victim, had told his wife to divorce him, to leave him. And he went to confront her. There's supposed to be some type of argument. He has a friend named Bo. His first name is John. And I can't pronounce his last name. I'm not even going to attempt to do that. But this guy has ties to organized crime. Martin Smart also has ties to drug trafficking. Now, people, of course, will say, well, look, it's got to be organized crime that did this. They may have come there. They killed these people because they were witness to something big. That is not what happened. This case is probably one of the most cut and dry cases I've ever seen. And usually we speculate about what happens. I believe wholeheartedly that Martin Smart and his friend Bo are the culprits. And I'll tell you exactly why, and why organized crime task force was brought in rather than a homicide. Ladies and gentlemen, Bo, the organized crime enforcer that was hanging around with Martin Smart, was actually running from the Chicago mob. The reason the DOJ sent organized crime FBI investigators is because they were his handlers. This guy was an informant, and he was in California hiding from the Chicago mob. When he got there, look, when you start working with the FBI, you think you have a green card to do whatever you want. It's basically a get-out-of-jail-free card because you're more important to the feds than you are to anybody else. And the feds always override state authorities. Also, the sheriff of this town was good friends with Martin Smart. And I'm sure that the investigators from the FBI, the organized task force, told this guy, back off. How do we know this? Well, now in 2016, when the investigation opens again, we suddenly find all these tapes. We find a letter from Martin Smart to his ex-wife where he actually admits to the murders. And I'll quote to you what it says because it's very telling in terms of his state of mind and what he believes is I guess a plea to his ex-wife as to why things happened and why, and for some reason now I can't find exactly, but it comes to the point where he says something to her regarding that her actions have now led to the loss of 4 lives. And then he goes on to say, and now you say you're through with me. That's very telling. It's cryptic, but it's very telling. Later on, a counselor, because this guy was a VA vet, supposedly went to Vietnam, his counselor or therapist comes forward and says that he actually admitted to killing Sue and Tina. But he says that he had nothing to do with killing the boys. Now that's extremely important because you have a killer admitting that he killed, but he has to be very specific because he doesn't want to be blamed for the murder of the boys. That, I believe, is a complete confession, one that's extremely telling. And the other guy, Bo, he's involved because he's backing up his partner, which they're both involved in some type of criminal activity. You don't get a guy who's a known drug dealer and a guy who's a former, or he is an enforcer for the Chicago mob together in the same room committing crimes unless they're in other kind of dealings together. So that's kind of my take of what's going on. That was the short version. But this has everything to do with cover-ups because Bo was an informant for the FBI.
Okay, where to start here on this one? I guess the first thing that's in my mind is, why do you think then that Martin would accept responsibility and confess to killing Sue and Tina, but not the boys? Is it because he didn't kill the boys?
Well, yes, I believe that that's probably true. But however, you have to understand that people that kill other people, sometimes they have remorse, especially when it comes to kids. You have a 12-year-old child who's been killed. He admits to that. But I believe it has to do with maybe, and this is a big maybe, this is me speculating, that he took responsibility for the woman because maybe something's missing. Those boys, maybe something happened to those boys that could be sexual in nature or something to that effect that he didn't want to have anything to do with. So he specifically copped to the murders of the women. So if anything comes up later that says, well, these boys were actually molested, he is not in any way related to that part of the crime.
Okay, well, let's get to motive, because this isn't a mob hit. The mob ain't going to go in there and start beating. Well, they have beaten people, obviously, with hammers and stuff. But boys, 12-year-old girls, I mean, I don't buy that. So explain what the motive would be between this killer and the victims.
Well, the killer is Martin. The motive is him. He is the motive, and Sue. That's the big part. I believe he lost his temper. He hit her with the butt of that rifle. The boys immediately responded. Bo subdued them, and it turned into a mess. This was something that these guys didn't go there with the intent to actually kill. This turned into something it wasn't supposed to be. The reason I know that Martin and Bo were involved, and I will state my reputation on this, and we hate to do this stuff, but I'm going to tell you why. That young boy in that other room is the big telling sign. You see, he was in a different room with two other boys, which were the sons of Sue. The young boy, Justin, is Martin's stepson. He's not going to kill him because he's in love with his mother as well. He may be cheating on her, but he's in love with the mother. He's not going to go in there to harm them other two boys because he can't trust that Justin's not going to open his mouth. And then we see Justin's actions after the murder. He keeps changing the story that he woke up and he saw two other men, and they bring in a sketch artist who's not really a sketch artist, and he gives a complete opposite description of men that have nothing to do or even close to his father. That's him trying to, in some way, protect the person he knows committed the crimes. And I say this because he comes forward and says, this is who did it. He's throwing the police off in his own way as a little boy is trying to protect someone that he probably looks up to or loves. So the motive is Martin killing Sue. Everything else is kind of an after thing, and I think it has to do with Bo. Bo is another factor in this thing, and I think his factor is sexual motivation. He's a killer, but once he gets there and he sees what's going on, he gets a little freaky, and that's why Martin is trying to separate himself from that by admitting he killed only the mother and the little girl later.
And you believe that the taking of Tina, and I think she was found 3 years later to the day, which is extraordinary as well. But she was found in a campground many miles away. What does that tell you?
Well, it tells me that she saw what happened, and at that particular moment, the anger, the rage of the two killers, which they both participated in the killing, saw her as a child, and they were hesitant. They didn't really know what to do with her. The boys are simple. They saw them as men. They responded as men. No big deal to them. The 12-year-old little girl was something totally different. They took her hoping to convince her she wouldn't say nothing. These guys are not thinking straight. And remember, both of these men had mental issues. They met at a VA hospital for people with mental issues, suffering from PTSD, etc. So these guys are not the brightest guys in the world, number one. And number two, they are not completely stable. So they took her hoping that somewhere in their mind they thought maybe we could convince her to say nothing. It wasn't clear. Like, I'm not clear about it. They weren't clear. Later, when it was obvious they could not have kept her quiet, they decided to kill her. And that's what happened to the small victim. And unfortunately, a child was killed in this situation.
Okay. Do you, a lot of people believe that Dana and Johnny walked in on the crime because I think they had their coats on and stuff and shoes on where the other victims didn't. You think that's a probability or a possibility, or were they already in the house when something happened?
Absolutely, and that's why I think that there was two people involved, because these are young men. One's 17, the one's 15. It's very hard to stop two kids from who walk in with clothes. So I think that it's very possible they walked in on this. And when they walked in on it, they became victims really by circumstance, not because they were intended as being victims. And remember, they were also not supposed to be there either. They had hitchhiked the first time, and the mother picked them up, brought them to Keddie, and a couple hours later they left again. They hitchhiked to another part of the county, and then later came home. It's very possible that they did not know, or the killers did not know that they would be there.
Okay.
But once they were in the crime scene, they immediately executed whatever plan they needed to protect themselves, preserve themselves. And that's usually what happens in these cases. These guys obviously are not serial killers by any stretch of the imagination. So I'm going a little bit beyond what I normally look at. However, in this situation, you have two perpetrators who are now in the motion, in the moment, and they're thinking instinctively. And that usually tells you exactly what happens in these cases, because they're acting instinctively. It's easier to guess what they did because of the crime scene and how people, humans, react to a situation of this caliber, which is extreme aggression, where a person loses their life and it gets their blood going. So they're not thinking anymore, they're just reacting.
Makes sense. How about the...
You have 60 seconds remaining.
Well, I'll get to it, I guess, when you call back.
Absolutely.
Okay. Usually, every episode, I end up throwing a bombshell at you. And it's not intentional. Now, so I might do that. You might know this, but you might not because you haven't brought it up. Certainly, when I read it, it was a bombshell to me. Would it change anything if I told you that Justin's DNA was found on the duct tape or medical tape that was around either Sue or the boys' wrists?
No, it doesn't. It surprised me. Actually, it goes more to exactly what I just said. Justin's father is a killer, along with his friend Bo. That tape could have been at his house. It's very easily looked at that maybe he played with the tape at the house. He used the tape for something else. He went to cut the tape with his teeth, and he left DNA on there. Meaning, it's not DNA in blood. It could be DNA saliva. It could be DNA. So it goes to the same thing. Now, again, this was prior to DNA evidence in the 1990s. So back then, they could only tell that the blood type was the same as a particular person, not specifically that individual. So it doesn't surprise me at all.
Okay. Yeah, the only thing that threw me for a loop was when Justin went under hypnosis. I think, you know, when he's talking about the dream that he had and seeing these people, he actually said in this dream he went out and tried to help Sue and take the the bindings off of her, and that would kind of corroborate, having his DNA found on the tape.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do have a big issue with hypnosis. Look, I'm not an expert at it. I'm a skeptic when it comes to this hypnosis thing. I have experienced supposedly what people call a person trying to put you under hypnosis. And, well, let's just say I was basically laughing to the whole thing, thinking, are you kidding me? That stuff is more, black magic and mumbo jumbo than actual getting people to really come through and say things. If someone gave me testimony under hypnosis, I would have a huge eyebrow risen because of that. I don't find it to be credible. I feel that people sometimes, the mind works a certain way. When you are under duress, stress, and, acute trauma, meaning witnessing something of that magnitude, the brain sometimes shuts corners off, puts walls up, so the person doesn't have to experience that trauma again, especially with a child. So I have a lot of issues with hypnosis, but as you said, the DNA was on a tape. It doesn't surprise me that the DNA doesn't tell you when the DNA was placed there. It could be placed there a day before, a month before, a year before. So, and again, was it full DNA analysis? Meaning, usually if you and I are brothers and they take a DNA sample, it's not DNA samples or an evaluation that's fully developed or looked at. You couldn't tell the difference between you and I as brothers until you specifically go into the special traits that identify you as an individual. So I have to know those facts as well, which we don't, or I don't at least.
Right. And I don't off the top of my head either. Another question that I have is there's some evidence that there was a fingerprint on the outside light bulb that was potentially unscrewed at the time, and that fingerprint has come back to Sheila Sharp, the teenage daughter who was spending the night in the next door cabin. So that inherently gave credence to some conspiracy theorists, or maybe not just conspiracy theorists, just people in general, I guess, that believe Sheila Sharp was involved with the slaughter of her family. What are your thoughts on that?
And your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
And what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's ridiculous. Listen, Sheila had nothing to do with this. The murder of her mother, her brothers, and her friends, and her younger sister. This is ridiculous. There was no relationship with another boy who could have done it. No. As I explained before, DNA is a tricky thing. Fingerprints are a tricky thing because they don't have a time stamp on it. It's not a video where you can look at it and say, oh, Ken and Bill walked in that liquor store at 14:05, or whatever time it was. That fingerprint could have been very simply a month prior to that. The mom said, hey, can you please change that light bulb? And she exactly does that. Now, if there was blood on the fingerprint from her mother, now that's telling a different story. But we don't have that. We have a fingerprint that has no timestamp. As far as I'm concerned, it's irrelevant. It actually goes to what we know about the crime scene, which was that she lived there. They moved in there a year prior to that. She could have very easily screwed the light bulb in because the light bulb wasn't working when they first moved in. I don't think it has any significance whatsoever.
Well, I agree with you 1,000% on that. Some other things, one of the things that I try to tell people is you don't have to make things as complicated as you do. Meaning a lot of times we've seen it with the Idaho case where people want to go down all these rabbit holes and, go over to crazy town when they don't have to. Now, this being a quadruple homicide like Idaho, people get the impression that one or two people can't kill four people. And it's absolutely ludicrous because we've seen it time and time again where you can. Now, Idaho is different because, probably 2 or 3 of the victims are sleeping at the time, so it's very easy. This case, a little different because probably 3 out of the 4 victims were awake. But if you have 2 offenders, very easy to control.
And I agree with you 100%. There is no doubt that sometimes we go down these rabbit holes looking for something much more complicated than what it really is. This case, to me, is cut and dry. Martin and Bo are the perpetrators. It's that simple. Now, we can't arrest them because, and again, here is where my eyebrow rises again, Kenan. Both Martin and Bo are dead within 8 years of this murder. One dies of cancer, the other one dies later, 4 years later, and it's very convenient. So for people who love theories of conspiracy, well, here you have it. You have organized crime involved only because this guy could be a snitch, and that makes you want to really look at this like, oh my God, it's a conspiracy. Well, it makes common sense. You have a guy who may be a snitch, and the FBI is involved.
This call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
Once they use him and they get what they want from him, the information, he's no longer that valuable. And you know this better than I do, because of your expertise in law enforcement, that once a CI, meaning a confidential informant, is used up, or he's, at some point, he wants to return to that lifestyle. I see it in prison all the time, guys who are former gang members, although they snitched on their friend, a part of them wants to go back to it. It's very easily thought of that this guy, Bo, could try to go back to his people in Chicago, and they found him and killed him, or at least made it look like he just died.
Okay, let me ask you this, Bill, because what I like to do is be able to learn from each case. So let's say you didn't have the names, Bo and Martin, and didn't know anything about these individuals, and you just had the crime scene. What would that tell you itself, the crime scene, without knowing anything? Would it tell you, hey, Sue was the intended target here? Or would it tell you, hey, Tina was the intended target, everybody else is collateral damage? I mean, just the crime scene itself, what would it tell you?
Well, it would tell me both those things, of course. I believe that Sue was subdued first because of the aggressiveness of the stab wound with no hesitation to her throat. But yes, of course, Tina seems to be, if we look at this with no names, with nobody else involved, in just the crime scene, the first thing I would think, at least I would investigate it thoroughly, is Tina. Was this behind a motive of abduction? And if so, what is related to it? So both of those cases are plausible. Now, there is the element of rape. There is the element of a sexual predator in this myth, or a person who was involved sexually with the person, meaning Martin. They could have been engaged in sex, and the 2 boys walked in. So again, all of these things play relevant to what we're looking at, but because we can't undo what we know. We know that Bo and Martin are involved. We know that his son is in the house. Too many circumstances, and as I said before, I don't believe in coincidences. That's why I put such a firm stamp on what happened that night, and I'm sticking to exactly that.
Okay, when I first looked at this case and looked at the crime scene photos and stuff, I kept going back to, I guess, Tina, because to me, other than Sue, it just appeared that Tina was the objective because she was taken from that house. And like you said, her shoes, clothing or whatever, it's gone. So it could go 2 ways. Hey, maybe we've seen before where she would have a boyfriend and the boyfriend would come over and slaughter the family. But that all changes when Tina's body or remains is found 3 years later. So to me, it was, hey, I just can't get off of the fact that Tina could be the main cause here for whatever reason it is, a sexual purpose. You could even go as far as saying child support purposes or whatever it is. But we have to figure out why she is missing from the house and not killed. But you explained it as, hey, we're maybe exhausted from killing 3 people. We're tired. She is a kid. Let's just take her. And of course, she's going to go somewhat willingly, right? Some people are going to say, well, why isn't she screaming so the next door neighbors are hearing? Well, I guess because she just saw her whole family get slaughtered, and she knew that she could easily be next unless she kept quiet. Does that make sense?
That's absolutely correct. And that's what I believe happened, that they weren't exhausted from killing. Look, there's 2 grown men, there's 3 people. It doesn't take a lot of effort, and if it does, your adrenaline is running. So you're not going to feel tired for at least another hour or 2 hours. I believe it just took her because at that moment, it just felt instinctive. Maybe there was a hesitation because she was such a young child, and they thought maybe they can keep her quiet. Obviously, later on, she probably started crying. She probably said she's going to tell, and then they killed her. I think that's very plausible. I don't believe they went there with the intent of taking her for child pornography or anything else, because it doesn't take that big of a monumental moment to get that accomplished. They could have grabbed her anywhere else if she was the intended target. They didn't have to come to the house. You see where I'm going with this?
Oh, yeah.
It does not have to. There doesn't have to be a triple murder or quadruple murder. They could have just snatched her anywhere if she was the intended target. That doesn't seem plausible to me. I'd love your intake, because again, your input on it, because you're a lot more familiar to that in the investigations about kidnapping and abductions than I am. What do you think about that?
No, you're 1,000% right on that. And I was sitting here shaking my head when you said it, because in my previous video about this case, I said the exact same thing. Is you can snatch her coming home from school. You can do it when the mom isn't around, because victimology shows that Sue wasn't around the house that much. So there's plenty of times that you could take her and not involve 3 other people.
You have 60 seconds remaining.
Plus the kids that were left alive. So yes, I am in definite agreement with you on that.
As I said, Ken, this case, although it's taking years to solve, I think could have been solved within the first 3 weeks. There's a lot of questions, as you know, because why it happened, but I think that what I've said seems to be the most plausible results, or the plausible reasons that it happened. Let me call you back, and it is going to cut off.
Yep.
Hey, Ken.
Okay, so I want to jump into the weapons here, because there are multiple weapons being used. Now, from my experience, usually if a murder is being premeditated, or that's the intent, an offender will come to the residence with a weapon. In this case, we have a hammer, we have a knife, we have a BB gun, which makes no sense to me. They all 3 could be weapons of opportunity, meaning no weapons were brought to the house, and they were all weapons from inside that residence. Now, I don't know that for sure, but that's a possibility. Give me your thoughts on these weapons.
Yeah, I think the weapons are a telling sign. It's very interesting you brought that up, because I was thinking the same thing. So, look, guys being guys, they go into a house, very plausible that Bo or Martin brought a hammer with them. It's an intimidation thing. They bring it with them because they're going to talk, or they're going to yell at somebody or say whatever. He's mad. Sue has told his wife, Marilyn, to leave him. This guy's ticked off. He's not a stable guy. He's a VA guy. He's got PTSD, which, again, all respect to the armed forces, but this guy's got some serious psychological issues. And his buddy Bo is no different. He's an enforcer for a mob, or he's supposed to be. And look, I can see how guys start talking to themselves. They may have been drinking. They're kind of ticked off. He grabs a hammer from home. It's an intimidation thing. He goes there. He's not trying to kill anybody, but it escalates. The BB gun is a perfect example of this being exactly what happened. He's not going to take a BB gun with him to the house. That gun probably was the property of one of the boys. It could have been the 10-year-old or even the 5-year-old. It could have been also the 15-year-old. That's what I believe owns the gun. I'd like to know more about whether they established whose BB gun rifle that was. Bo and Martin are not bringing that to the crime scene. But maybe
This call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
she got upset. How dare you? Confrontation starts. He sees the gun. He picks it up because it is a rifle, but it's an air rifle. It gives the sense of maybe that macho in him, trying to establish dominance or at least control the crime scene. So he picks it up and he cracks her over the head with it, and there it begins to escalate. We know that the knives was a steak. There was two knives, I believe. One was a steak knife that came from the house. They just picked that up, and again, that happens as everything escalates. They're just grabbing whatever they have. This isn't a huge mansion. This is a small cabin. So the steak knives are at the ready. He goes in the kitchen. He opens the drawer. It's the first thing he sees. Which one picked it up, I don't know. But it seems to me that this is a crime scene that happened as it happened, as opportunity began to unfold, as the tempers rise, as passions rise, as blood gets going. That's how this happened.
So there are some nicks, like knife marks, knife ticks into the wall, as if, somebody is playing with a knife and kind of like jabbing it into the wall. And those tick marks were not there previous to this homicide. Now, to me, that would almost go to what you just said as an intimidation factor, as if, almost like picking up the BB gun, where you're standing there and, having a conversation that turns confrontational, and you're just like taking that knife and kind of like just real gently nicking on that wood, like, as an intimidation factor. That could explain why those nicks were there as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Remember, there is no book written of rules on how to murder somebody there's people who have written books like that, but remember, this is a passionate situation. This is an explosive situation. The human psyche is very interesting. It does certain things. Sometimes the primal part of your brain takes over when it knows something like this is going to happen. So you do things that you normally wouldn't do. And I know these profilers and so-called experts always have an opinion. It's usually just called human nature or animalistic nature, because we are animals. And I mean that because it's actually a fact. And the only difference between us and a dog or a cat or a gorilla is that we have the ability to reason. When we are not reasoning and we have allowed those primal instincts to take over, ladies and gentlemen, the human animal does some really interesting things and weird things that no one can explain. So when you hear these so-called experts that have read all these books, that have never been in a crime scene, that have never committed a crime, or are not even in law enforcement, make all these, assumptions of why and give you reasons, I want all of you just to raise your eyebrows and say BS. Because there's no way they can tell you exactly what was going on in that room. Because I've seen personally men kill other men in front of me. And they do really weird things that no one would expect them to do. And they're seasoned killers. I've been on yards where guys with knives stabbed another guy to death in front of him. And suddenly the killer does something so crazy that you're like, what the hell was that about? But it's just his brain functioning instinctively. Let me give you a quick example. I saw a guy on death row walk up to another guy and stab him more than 18 times, killing him. Then the guy who actually did the killing walks over, picks up his lunch, sets it down by the punching bag, and hits the bag for about 30 seconds, and then walks away. Okay, why would he pick up the lunch? Why would he hit the bag? There's no explanation. We cannot tell why a killer does what he does in that moment, because it's instinct.
Right. That's a good example. You had talked earlier, and I want to get another example from you about how the brain sometimes will kind of shut down and try not to remember certain tragedies. In your book, you explained your case and how that kind of happened to you as well. So you have personal knowledge of how the brain can kind of like try to just not go back to that scene in your mind. Is that what you were trying to talk about?
Yes, and if there was a camera right now, you would see me nodding because this is exactly what I'm referring to. Let me give you a small example so we understand what Ken is referring to. In my book, Escape Artist, Memoir of a Visionary on Death Row, which is it's an autobiography of what happened that night, why I'm in prison, and everything surrounding my life. I give prime examples of exactly what I'm talking about. For example, at the age of 13, I began to take Dianabol. It's an anabolic steroid. My father gave it to me to make me bigger, faster, stronger, and to compete in fighting competitions. During my teenage years, whenever I lost my temper or I became very emotionally aggravated, I would see red. My vision would cloud and become red, and I would usually go into blackouts. I would get into a fight, I would do something, and then I would wake up 8 hours later and have no memory of what happened from the moment I threw the first punch, because my body, my mind blocked it out. Now, of course, I was supercharged by anabolic steroids, which is a little bit different. However, yes, you are correct. The night that I was convicted of a killing, there was a very emotional confrontation, and at one point I could taste copper in my mouth, and I knew the red zone was coming, which is what I refer to in my book. You see everything red, and I blacked out. It has been 41 years since that date, and as much as I've tried to remember what happened from the initial confrontation to now, I haven't been able to. It's blocked from my mind. Believe me, I've tried to open that door. I've tried to see what happened to give sense to why everything happened, and I haven't been able to. But instinctively, I was responding, and I can't tell you why. And there's not a psychologist in the world that can tell you why. And this is the same case, what I'm talking about. The mind instinctively goes into overdrive. It shuts or puts walls up. And we've seen this in victims as well. They don't remember what happened to them. It's not that they don't want to, ladies and gentlemen. The mind puts up walls to safeguard that mind from that trauma.
So, I've always been under the assumption, and I've interviewed many people who have killed, and I've gotten that before from them. I don't remember. I blacked out. And I always...
This call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
I always just chalked it up to bullshit. That, hey, they're lying to me. They don't want to admit to it. Now, over the years, and especially since talking to you, I've kind of softened my stance on that. So you're saying that if I interview people and they tell me, hey, I don't remember, or I blacked out, I can get you this far, but then I don't remember, and then I come to, 4 hours later. You're saying that I should certainly, and any other investigator should put merit into that.
Well, that's not exactly what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, I can tell you from cases that I've seen, and I'm a prime example of it. But the difference between me and other people who are in the middle of an investigation when they're actually trying to say, well, I don't remember, they're not trying to take responsibility. The difference with me is I've taken responsibility for everything that happened that night. So I have no reason to lie. I really can't remember. There are people that have experienced that. And I'm not saying that 9 out of 10 or 8 out of 10 or 5 out of 10 this is possible. I think every case should be looked upon differently. And if you have an established pattern of maybe drug use, and maybe this has happened before, then maybe you should look at it for what it is. But if the guy comes in and says, look, I did it, I'm sorry, I just don't remember what happened from this point, but he's taking responsibility, I would at least I would entertain the thought that maybe this guy's telling the truth. Now, same thing with victims. I mean, we're not here advocating that when someone says they don't remember and they're a victim, they shouldn't be believed. I believe that you should believe them. The victim has no reason to lie unless you can find a reason. But I said, every case is different, and every case should be evaluated on the merit of that particular case. So when it comes to other killers, and they just say, I don't remember, You have to look at the case as a whole and then determine whether you give that merit or not.
Right. All right. Well, we got off on a little bit there. Let's try to get back onto Keddie case specifically. And I guess what I want to talk about is the likelihood of strangers doing this. And there was a movie called The Strangers, which was a pretty big hit that was based off of this movie. And there was another one called Cabin 28. But strangers just coming into a house and slaughtering the people in it. In your experience, do you think that that is a rarity, or is that the norm, or is it 50-50? Because, sometimes it's people want to look at the people that's closest to the victims, and it's more simple. Do you know what I'm saying there? What do you think?
Well, this is, like I said a million times, this better than I do. But yes, law enforcement usually look at someone close to the victim to find the perpetrator. And because people's family members or friends that kill them are not expert murderers, it's always easy to catch them, or pretty much easy to catch them. When it comes to a stranger, it's much more difficult because it's a random victim. And although it's just as gruesome, it's very hard to connect a random person to a crime scene. Most of the time, in these murders, the crime was committed by someone who knows. It's usually between, 8 and 8.5% out of 9. It's usually a person the victim knows. Random killings, like a serial killer, are so...
You have 60 seconds remaining.
Out of 1,000 cases, it's usually 990 people. 990 of the cases, the person actually knows, and there's a real logical motive, not a correct one, but a motive as to why they kill. Serial killers, there's 40 to 60 work in the United States per year. The chances that you getting hit by a serial killer, you probably have more chance of getting hit by lightning in a bottle twice than that.
All right.
Let me call you back.
Okay.
Link.
Hey, Ken.
Okay, so I forget exactly what we were talking about. I think strangers and how likely somebody just happens to be riding past that cabin and decides this is the place that we're going to go into and kill. But, if that does happen, it's possible, but, not really probable. But there has to be a motive behind that, such as robbery. I was just working on a case this morning where a group of like 4 guys were driving around drinking the back roads, and they decided, hey, this is a royal house. We're going to go in there and hit them, meaning we're just going to rob them. Well, it ended up, they killed the mom and the 2 kids. But there was motive behind it. It was robbery, and they were strangers. So it does happen. But in this particular case, in the Keddie murders, there is not a stranger just riding down the road and decides to go in there and rob them. It's more of a personal conflict motive, and that's what you're seeing as well, right?
Absolutely. And look, if I was a conspiracist and I was looking for motives, I would say, listen, look at the house. House 23 or cabin 28, is away from the other cabins. It's substantially distanced from other cabins. It's the perfect cabin for a predator to come and see and say, wow, I can really get away with this here. Sure, all those things exist, but just about in every case that you know of, I'm sure you could find those elements there. As you said earlier, it's not advisable always to go down these rabbit holes of conspiracy. Sometimes it's rare, but sometimes it's as easy as it looks. And in this case, at least in my opinion, it's that easy. The killers of Sue, John, Dana, and Tina are Martin Smart and his friend Bo, which I'm not going to try and pronounce his last name. Those are the killers, and they are now dead. And unfortunately, 4 people lost their lives because of really just guys who just didn't know how to deal with the situation and became really killers. And I feel really bad for the family, for obviously Sheila and the two boys that were left without a mother, a brother, and a sister. It's tragic, but as you know, it happens all the time, and we're just to hopefully bring a bit of insight into the case, as well as maybe public opinion and maybe public interest, and if someone knows something, they would come forward.
Yeah, so I think I'm guilty of this sometimes as well, more so in the past than present, but people will look at crime scene photos and try to ascertain details from an event that happened, such as, well, in this case, the Keddie murders, there's a couch cushion on the floor, and Dana's head is halfway rested on it. So people will hone in on that and try to figure out why. Why were they trying to make him feel comfortable in his time of death? Were they trying to smother him? When actually, you don't have to worry about that. It has no bearing on the overall consensus of what happened in this case and who's responsible. And I find that with amateur detectives online all the time. And so what's your opinion about that?
I'm again, kind of nodding my head because you're right on point. This is the difference between an experienced pair of eyes and a person who reads a bunch of books and then thinks he's a freaking detective. Look, we have other people on YouTube and other channels that do the same thing, and they go over these theories, these rabbit holes, and the cushion was this. The cushions are relevant, ladies and gentlemen. Let's look at the big picture. You're focusing on the little dot in the middle of the canvas rather than the canvas itself. And that's a huge problem. And you're right. Amateurs sometimes just muddy the water and make things worse.
Yeah, I just want people to understand that when they start looking at crime scenes and photos, not to always just zone in on one little detail and try to drive themselves crazy figuring out why. Because you can't. The murder is fluid. Everything that's happening in that crime scene is fluid. And like you said with the guy grabbing his lunch and hitting a bag, sometimes you don't know why they do it.
Your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
It just happens because murder is fluid. So look at the overall scheme and not the dots, right?
That's exactly right, and that's the difference between an experienced pair of eyes, and that's why when you and I first started speaking, first started looking at cases together, and you said, look, take a look at the case, and I want to get your opinion because you didn't know what I brought to the table, and now that we're doing this for a while, we're beginning to see correlation between the way you think an experienced detective and how I think a person who experienced probably more conversations and interactions and studies with serial killers than anybody on earth. So you're right. It's about experienced eyes and what's really relevant to the crime scene rather than things that have nothing to do with it and people focus on it.
So, like you had talked about, serial killing is very rare. Do you think Martin and Bo had killed before or since?
No, well, I mean, anything's possible. I don't think so. I think that this was a very unique situation that called this guy's instincts into play, and they responded by killing. But they had a motive. This wasn't a killing because they were just there to kill. They lost their temper. However, the fluid or the moment evolved. That's what this is about. Now, they could have killed before. I'm sure that Bo may have killed and shot somebody. It's very possible. But these guys are not serial perpetrators or anything of that sort. These guys were just two guys who, in one given situation where emotions and feelings were involved between him and Sue, or what she was commenting on that upset him, and he responded with murder.
And it was not, in your eyes, a sexually motivated crime.
I don't believe that's the initial motive. Now, it could have become that she had she was naked from the waist down, suggests that maybe at some point through there was an aggressive move towards a sexual encounter. And we all know that rape is not about love. It's not about, it's a violent event. It's not about sex. It's about violence. And at that moment, maybe there was that, quick response, and clothes were torn or taken off, or maybe even the intimidation of rape. So that, again, it's impossible to tell what happened unless we have a DNA kit and somebody performed a rape kit on Sue.
And Sue's underwear getting shoved into her throat. Any particular meaning you feel behind that, or was that just to shut her up?
Well, I think it's it was there to shut her up, but I believe that it also proves that taking off her clothes are part of this crime. She wasn't sleeping naked with her shirt on and her panties off or her pants off. This proves that the taking of her clothes or removing of her clothes was done during this event, and that's why there's a suggestion of rape, or at least the intimidation of rape.
Yeah, so it makes me believe that it occurred while she was there without the boys being there, and everybody else was probably in bed. Tina, everybody else, and something with Sue and Marty and even Bo happening in the living room. And then the boys walked in on it, and that's when all hell broke loose, because I believe Johnny would have tried to protect his mother from whatever was happening, and then it all went downhill from there.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And as I mentioned, she was the intended, let's call it victim, but I don't think that they had murder on their mind. But it really spiraled out of when the boys either walked in or surprised them or tried to defend the mother, and that's when things went crazy. Because now you have two what can be perceived as young men defending their mother or their mother's friend, and you have two other men who are the perpetrators. Now they take that very personal. The hammer's used. So yes, you're absolutely right.
Yeah, so if people are wondering why there was so much violence towards the boys, amateurs want to say, well, that's because they were the targets. And I push back on that, saying, no, it's because those boys were aggressive. They were fighting. So the men are going to inflict more aggressive pain and wounds to those boys.
Exactly right. They were there as adversaries, and they were hit in the head. They weren't hit in the arms to just stop them. They were hit in the head to stop them from preventing them from trying to stop the situation. And that's actually, I believe, exactly what happened. But as I said before, the mother was the target of whatever they had in mind. The boys became later, but as you said, they came in to defend the mother, and they were looked upon as opponents, and that's why they were struck on the head to subdue them, and that's why they were tied up. They were tied up while they were still conscious.
Well, why do you think that this case, I mean, I've looked at thousands of cases, why do you think this case has gained such, infamy? Movies being made of it, documentaries left and right. What's the deal with this case? Why is it so famous?
Well, I mean, it's unsolved. It's quadruple murder. You have children involved. It's California. And look, sometimes cases just become media and movie darlings. Let me give you an example, which is actually a horrible example but look at Scott Peterson. We know that he killed his wife and his unborn child. This happens, unfortunately, several times a year in the United States, yet he became the poster child for it. It's just one of those things. Some cases catch a lot of attention by the media, other cases don't. In this case, it caught media attention, and it has a bit of conspiracy, has a bit of a hunting effect of a cabin, out there in the woods. It just plays into perfect drama, and people picked up on it.
And it doesn't have to be all that, right? It's a lot more simpler when you look at it from unbiased eyes from the outset. There's people that have spent decades, Bill, looking at
This
this
call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
looking at this case and going down a million rabbit holes. There's websites dedicated to it, just like West Memphis 3. And really, if you just step back with unbiased eyes and not go down those rabbit holes and not go to crazy land all the time, it's relatively simple to explain, right?
I believe so, but again, we have a lot of people that get involved in these cases that don't have experienced eyes, and they're seeing things that don't exist, or they're not seeing the most obvious thing. You know, in this case between you and I, you have two guys who have seen this, have talked about it, have been around it, and see it for what it is, which I believe experienced, non-biased law enforcement would have done from the beginning. However, we have a sheriff here who is biased. We have a possible mob connection and FBI investigators for organized crime. That says a whole lot. You have people in this case who did not want the truth to come forward, and I believe that is the big conspiracy. Nothing else, just that.
Okay. All right. Well, I think that's going to do it for this case. Do you have anything you want to add, either on this case or personally? Let people know what you have going on.
Well, I appreciate it. I appreciate you letting me come on here and give my opinion and help in any way I can. I can't always help, but I try to. In terms of personally, I would ask people to please sign up for my newsletter at artistwilliamnoguera.com. We're working on a YouTube channel that we're going to put up for everything William Noguera will be there, opinions as well as the latest on me and past episodes.
You have 60 seconds remaining.
And I appreciate people taking a look at it when it comes up. And that's about it, Ken. I really appreciate your time and letting me come on, and best to you and to the audience, and I hope everybody's well and safe.
Same to you, and we'll end this by, as always, me hoping and wishing you the best and staying safe. So there you have it. Bill give his assessment on what he thinks. It seems like we agree on most everything. I was a little worried in the beginning when he started going down conspiracy land and talking about the mafia and stuff. I was like, oh boy, where's he going with this? But he pulled it back around to where I think we agreed on almost everything. This is the first assessment that he's done with me where he was very confident about Marty and Bo being the offenders in this case. I never name names usually. I won't say never, but so I'm not ready to go there yet, but I respect Bill's assessment on this. He certainly believed that Sue was the target and stuff got out of hand. The boys more than likely walked in and they were dealt with by more than likely those two offenders. And I like how he didn't have to listen to all the noise, although he did say that he did see some conspiracy land stuff on this. So since he's been transferred from San Quentin off of death row to Corcoran, I think he may have internet privileges, and maybe that's where he's seen some of this stuff instead of it being mailed to him as usual. I'm not sure, and it really doesn't matter to me as long as he has the information to look at. Anything else? Does this Sheila Sharp being involved, he agreed with me that it's asinine, and whoever believes that and the people that perpetrate that onto the public ought to be ashamed of themselves, and they're not detectives. You're not going to have one detective come forward that knows the case to say that Sheila Sharp is involved in this. The people that do that are just idiots, okay? So don't listen to them. Tina, I think his thoughts on Tina being taken, I can get behind for sure. Again, I had thought that she may have been the target of this, but he brought up things that I had brought up in the previous video, like, you could take her from a bus stop or from the schools and stuff like that. So we were kind of on agreement on that. I wrote down some stuff here about Sheila Sharp, the multiple weapons being weapons of opportunity. He said that more than likely the assailant brought the hammer, but not because they wanted to commit murder. It was more of an intimidation factor. The way that I took it is, hey, listen, there was a conflict between Marty and Sue. And he went over there to confront her, and he had a hammer, whatever it was. Maybe they engaged in some sort of consensual relationship, but Bo was there as well. He brought him over, and things went sideways. I buy into that because Sue being the target, you know, her state of dress, the panties being shoved in her mouth, and the fact that Marty and his girlfriend had broken up that day, and Sue may have been the cause of that. Remember, when there's a homicide, you have to look for triggers. What took place, you know, that made this happen? And that very well that could be it. I mean, that's a good trigger for Marty to go over there and confront her and say, hey, why'd you say this? Why'd you do this? Sue, you know, depending on her victimology, might have stood her ground. What if she slapped him and he snapped and the killings happen? Whatever it is. Listen, I haven't solved this murder. Okay? I just given opinions, and Bill just gave an opinion. And those opinions happen to have common sense and to make sense. Whereas some of these other things like Sheila being involved and just completely asinine. Okay? I don't know how people sleep with themselves. I don't know. Listen, I don't get much of today's society anyhow. So I guess me wondering why people make asinine claims and put clickbait titles up, or whatever. I shouldn't even care, right? It doesn't involve me. I just want to, I'm always empathetic towards family members. It's the way I am. And for common sense. I'm empathetic to common sense. Yes. I guess that kind of makes sense. Things are usually what they seem. This was a little tough, I have to admit. But two very good suspects. And Bill gave his opinion, and I'm going to leave it at that. You know, at some point in time, I will be going out and meeting and talking with Sheila Sharp. Right now, we stay in communication via email, but I want to go out there, meet her, and really look at the scene. I know the cabin isn't there anymore, but the area is still the same. I got to do that, and there are plans to make that happen. So I look forward to that, and I hope you guys got something from Bill and his common approach, theories. You know, again, I was a little worried about the mafia connection, but how he steered it makes complete sense to me. Now, cover-ups, I knew where he was going when he was starting to say about an FBI informant and stuff. I knew where he was going with that. Whether it was this crime was covered up because one of the people were informants, I don't know about that. Possible, maybe even probable, but I haven't researched enough of that area to make that determination myself. Bill obviously is comfortable saying it, and he can do that. I won't do that yet, but I agree with his assessment. So that's it for this edition of Redemption from Death Row, and I hope you learned something and enjoyed the show. All right, until next time, thanks for watching. Maine's out.